like, subscribe, and share. The Crying Bridge Tinka-Tran-Csu. In a remote part of northern Vietnam, nestled between two villages, stands an old stone bridge. It stretches across a narrow river, its weathered stones darkened by centuries of rain and moss. To most, the bridge appears unremarkable, but to the villagers who live nearby, it is known as the Crying Bridge, Suk in Vietnamese. The name comes from the eerie, unexplained cries that can be heard late at night, echoing from the river below. The legend of the Crying Bridge goes back generations. Long ago, during a time of war, the river served as a dividing line between two rival factions. It was said that one night, a young woman named Thur, who lived in one of the villages, fled to the bridge, trying to escape the violence. She was supposed to meet her lover, a soldier from the opposing faction, and together they planned to run away and start a new life. However, their plan ended in tragedy. Thur was caught by the soldiers from her own village, accused of treason for loving the enemy. She was thrown into the river and drowned beneath the bridge. Since then, the villagers claim that Thu's restless spirit haunts the bridge, crying for her lost love and the life she never had. On certain nights, when the moon is high and the wind is still, the sound of a woman weeping can be heard rising from the river, carried on the breeze. The villagers avoid the bridge after dark, fearful of encountering the spirit of Thur and the curse that follows those who linger too long. Hung, a traveling teacher, recently moved to one of the villages. He had heard the stories about the Crying Bridge from the locals, but like many others, he dismissed them as mere superstition. He was a man of logic and reason, and he believed that every ghost story had a rational explanation. One evening, after staying late at the village school to grade papers, Hung found himself walking home in the dark. His path led him over the Crying Bridge, and as he approached, the moonlight illuminated the old stones, casting long shadows across the river bank. Though the air was still, Hung couldn't shake the feeling of unease that crept over him. As he stepped onto the bridge, the faint sound of weeping reached his ears. Hung stopped in his tracks, his pulse quickening as the soft, sorrowful cries floated up from the river below. He strained to listen, convincing himself it must be an animal or the wind playing tricks on him. But the sound was unmistakable. Someone was crying. He leaned over the side of the bridge, peering into the water. The river was calm, reflecting the silver light of the moon. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the crying continued, growing louder, more heart-wrenching. Hung's grip tightened on the bridge's stone railing as a chill ran down his spine. Could the villagers' stories be true? No, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. It's just the sound of the water, nothing more. He took a deep breath and began walking again, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. But the further he walked, the louder the cries became, as if they were following him. He stopped again, his heart pounding in his chest. The crying was no longer distant. It sounded as though someone was right beneath the bridge, sobbing in despair. Hung's rational mind struggled to find an explanation. He had crossed this bridge many times during the day without hearing a thing. Why now, at night, did the cries become so loud and unbearable? His curiosity got the better of him, and against his better judgment, he decided to investigate. He carefully made his way down the steep embankment to the river bank, his flashlight illuminating the path ahead. The grass was wet with dew, and the air felt colder the closer he got to the water. The cries continued, louder now, almost desperate. When Hung reached the river bank, he scanned the area with his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but rocks and tall grass. He felt a momentary sense of relief. There was no one here. But just as he was about to turn back, he saw something that made his blood run cold. At the edge of the river, partially submerged in the water, was the figure of a woman. Her long, dark hair floated on the surface, and she was dressed in a traditional white gown, the fabric clinging to her body. Her back was turned to him, and her shoulders shook as she wept. Hung's breath caught in his throat. Every instinct told him to run, to leave the bridge and never return. But something about the woman's sorrow held him in place. He took a hesitant step forward. "Miss," he called out, his voice trembling. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The woman's sobbing stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was complete silence. Hung stood frozen, waiting for her to respond, but she remained motionless. Slowly, she began to rise from the water, her movements unnaturally fluid, as if she were floating. Hung's heart pounded in his chest as the woman turned to face him. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and dark. Water dripped from her gown as she stared at him, her expression blank but filled with a deep, unspoken pain. Suddenly, the woman opened her mouth, and a wail of sorrow erupted from her, louder than before, echoing through the night. Hung stumbled backward, fear surging through him as the weight of her anguish crashed over him like a wave. Without thinking, he turned and ran, scrambling up the embankment as fast as he could. The woman's cries followed him, growing fainter the further he got from the river, but they never completely disappeared. Even when he reached the village, breathless and shaking, he could still hear the distant sound of weeping, as if it had embedded itself in his mind. The following day, Hung couldn't focus on his work. The encounter with the weeping woman haunted him, replaying in his mind over and over. He had heard ghost stories before, but nothing like this. He had seen her, he was certain of it, and the sound of her cries still lingered in his ears. Determined to understand what he had experienced, Hung sought out Old Lady Kim, one of the village's oldest residents and a keeper of local lore. She had lived through the wars, witnessed the changes in the village, and knew the history of the Crying Bridge better than anyone else. Hung found her sitting on the porch of her small home, knitting a scarf. When he approached, she looked up, her eyes sharp despite her advanced age. "You've seen her, haven't you?" she said before Hung could even speak. He blinked, surprised by her bluntness. I think so. Last night, by the river." She was crying. Old Lady Kim sighed and motioned for him to sit. "That bridge has been haunted for longer than I've been alive," she said, her voice low and serious. "But it's not just any ghost. It's the spirit of Thur." Hung had heard the name before, but he didn't know the full story. "Who was Thur?" he asked, leaning forward, eager for answers. Old Lady Kim set down her knitting and folded her hands in her lap. "Thur was a young woman who lived here many years ago. She was kind, beautiful, and loved by everyone in the village. But she fell in love with a soldier from the other side of the war, an enemy in the eyes of her family and neighbors. The two of them planned to run away together, to escape the fighting and start a new life. They were supposed to meet at the bridge one night and leave the village for good." Kim's eyes grew distant as she continued, but word got out about their plan. Thu's family and some of the villagers found out and were furious. They accused her of betraying her people, of treason. When they found her at the bridge, waiting for her lover, they dragged her to the river and threw her in. She drowned that night, alone and heartbroken. Hung felt a pang of sadness as he listened. It was a tragic story, but it didn't explain why her spirit still haunted the bridge. "Why does she cry?" he asked quietly. Old Lady Kim's eyes darkened. "Thu's spirit has never been able to find peace. Her lover never came for her, whether he was killed or abandoned her. No one knows. But she waits for him still, crying for the love she lost and the life she never had. Some say she lures people to the bridge, hoping to find someone who can take her place or help her finally find rest. Others believe she's simply reliving that terrible night over and over." Hung shivered at the thought. He had seen her sorrow firsthand, felt the weight of her pain. It was more than just a haunting, it was a soul trapped in a moment of endless grief. "Is there any way to help her?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Old Lady Kim sighed again, her expression weary. "Many have tried. Prayers, offerings, even rituals to cleanse the bridge. But nothing has worked. Her pain is too deep, her sorrow too strong. She is bound to that place, and I fear she always will be." Hung thanked her for the story and left, his heart heavy. As he walked back through the village, He couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be a way to help her. He couldn't bear the thought of her spirit, weeping alone at the bridge for all eternity. That night, Hung couldn't sleep. The sound of Thu's cries haunted him, filling his dreams and waking thoughts. He had never believed in spirits before, but now, after seeing her and hearing her story, he felt a responsibility to do something to help her find peace. Against his better judgment, Hung decided to return to the crying bridge. He wasn't sure what he could do, but he couldn't ignore her suffering. Armed with a lantern and an offering of flowers and incense, he made his way through the dark streets of the village, heading toward the river. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The air was still, just like the night before, and the village was quiet. As Hung approached the bridge, his heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to keep walking. When he reached the center of the bridge, he knelt down and placed the flowers and incense on the stone surface. He lit the incense, watching as the smoke curled upward, disappearing into the night sky. "I'm sorry for what happened to you, Thur," he said softly, his voice trembling. "You didn't deserve to die that way. I don't know if you can hear me, but I wanted to help you find peace." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the temperature around him dropped, and the familiar sound of weeping began to rise from the river below. Hung's heart raced, but he stayed where he was, his eyes scanning the water. The mist began to rise again, swirling around the base of the bridge. And then, just as before, the figure of a woman appeared at the edge of the river, her white gown glowing faintly in the moonlight. Her sobs filled the air, heartbreaking and endless. Hung stood, holding the lantern in one hand and the incense in the other. "Thur," he called out gently, "I know you're in pain. I know you've been waiting for a long time. But your lover isn't coming. He's gone. You don't have to wait anymore." The ghostly figure didn't move at first, but then she slowly lifted her head, her hollow eyes locking onto his. The sadness in her gaze was overwhelming, and Hung had to fight the urge to run, but he stood his ground. "I'm sorry," he continued, "but it's time to let go. You deserve to rest." Thu's cries grew louder, echoing through the night. The mist around her thickened, and for a moment, it seemed as though the entire river was coming to life, swirling with her grief and rage. But then, gradually, her wails began to soften. The ghost bride looked up at him one last time, her expression filled with sorrow and gratitude. Slowly, her form began to fade, dissolving into the mist. The cries faded with her, leaving only the soft sound of the river below. Hung stood there for a long time, staring at the place where she had disappeared. The air around him felt lighter, the weight of her grief finally lifted. As he turned to leave the bridge, he whispered a final prayer for Thur, hoping that wherever she was now, she had finally found the peace she had longed for.